Hi everyone. This is Vahid Yazdanpanah from University of Southampton. It's my pleasure to present this work as the first talk in the ROP Symposium on Embedding AI in Society. It's a work on responsibility ascription in trustworthy autonomous systems. I have to admit that it's an attempt towards a roadmap, a research agenda. Basically, here in this talk, we identify responsibility-related research challenges and hinting towards some potential solution concepts. It's a joint work with Enrico Gerding, Sebastian Stein, Timothy Norman, and Sarvapali Gopal Ramchurn from University of Southampton. And from Netherlands, we have Mehdi Dastani from Utrecht University and Catholijn Jonker from Delft University of Technology in Delft. This is a work funded by Autotrust, autotrust.org.uk. It's a research platform to enable early career researchers to help developing this idea of human-centered Internet of Vehicles. But as you see here in this talk, we are approaching a more general platform for responsibility reasoning in general in autonomous systems. And this was actually motivated by TAS Research Hub. TAS stands for Trustworthy Autonomous Systems. It's a research hub funded by UK's Body on Research and Innovation, UKRI. The main point in this hub is to develop socially beneficial autonomous systems. It's a hub led by University of Southampton, and Professor Ramchurn is the director of this hub. As you see here, the grand challenges for TAS and the hub itself is actually to ensure that TAS benefits rather than damage our society and the economy, to safeguard our freedoms, and to improve our physical and mental well-being in general. So you see here that we're looking at different aspects of autonomous systems and how they can benefit society as a whole. So the talk itself. In a nutshell, basically, it's not a technical talk, so relax. Here, we try to talk about different aspects of responsibility and how this notion can help developing trustworthy autonomous systems, and how basically responsibility reasoning and the notion of responsibility itself relates to tasks, and how responsibility and different forms, different aspects of responsibility relate to different aspects of trustworthiness, basically looking at responsibility as a kind of intermediary notion. So thinking that trustworthiness is a complex notion, how responsibility can stay in between and help defining various aspects of trustworthiness. Basically, we go through two lines, ex ante responsibilities, when we are talking about who should take, or in future, who is capable of accepting some tasks basically here, who is capable of what, and then backward-looking notions. So who should bear the blame? So something already took place, is materialized, and we want to know who should pay to what extent, who is liable to what extent, and who was capable of what, basically. And at the end, we talk about three research lines. So first, task and responsibility. When we look at this notion of trustworthiness as a kind of complex notion, they try to break it down in terms of more simpler notions like functionality, legality, resilience, security, and verifiability. So an autonomous system is trustworthy if it satisfies all these conditions. What we are arguing here, the notion of responsibility can contribute as well, and also links to all these aspects. Not that a responsible autonomous system is trustworthy by definition, but that by means of responsibility reasoning, we can contribute to all these aspects. We contribute to legality of tasks, its resilience, security, and verifiability. As you see, inherently, such a study is interdisciplinary. Here you see like 4 lines that to be able to reason about responsibilities in autonomous systems, we need to talk about philosophy of AI and ethics by design, how notion of autonomy and responsibility conceptually link to each other. So whether an autonomous agent by definition is also a responsible one or the other way around. So this is one aspect. Then how we can basically we need to talk about sociological aspects of agency and autonomy. When we introduce autonomous systems into society, how they affect the society and what are the implications of such an introduction. Whether we end up with levels of autonomy, accordingly levels of agency and responsibility, in case we have collaboration between artificial agents and humans. And then in the third phase, you see legal studies. So how jurisprudential perspective on responsibility, when something takes place, who is to what extent liable? It's kind of new open question, whether we can see artificials as liable or not, whether they are moral agents, let's say. And finally, from technological perspective, how various technologies from multi-agent systems and formal methods can help us developing decision support tools. So in case we have, let's say, autonomous vehicles on the road, so we are automatizing transportation, but if we still have traditional judiciary system, so we are consuming much more, let's say, we are putting much effort into thinking and reasoning about who is liable. So only automatizing transportation is not sufficient. We probably need some automated reasoning for judiciary system as well. Our motto here is, with more autonomy comes more and different forms of responsibility. So not that just with autonomy comes responsibility, but we have actually different forms of responsibilities here. Here we structure the talk with respect to retrospective and prospective responsibility. And so in retrospective responsibility, basically we are focused on approaches to reason about level of causality or contribution of agents in the occurrence of an already realized already realized outcome. So something is materialized, so we want to know who is to what extent liable or blamable. Then in prospective form, basically we are talking about capacities of agents towards a state of affairs in prospect. Something can take place. Here you see in the center we have this Uber crash case. So whether like minutes before this crash, some agents could see to it that, or could avoid such a situation in future. And then in retrospective form, we are looking at this event and thinking about who could potentially avoid it. So here we are trying to look at these two aspects and see what research challenges we have and what are ways forward. So first, prospective responsibility in trustworthy autonomous systems. How looking in the future can help us here to reason about trustworthiness of autonomous systems. The first title that I have here is accountability reasoning for trustworthy autonomous systems functionality. How we can use notion of accountability as a kind of intermediary term to think about functionality of trustworthy autonomous systems. The formulation of the challenge is the need for operational accountability, ascription, and task coordination methods in the organizational context of autonomous systems. Here, as a way forward, for instance, we can think about this notion of a strategic responsibility that we have in the literature of multi-agent systems. This is to look at capacities of agents in a point in time who can see to it that the state of affairs phi materializes. And you see here also a link between this way of prospective responsibility, a link to retrospective responsibility. For instance, given a history of events, if agent A is, we see agent A accountable if it was tasked and able to deliver phi, but failed to do so. So here we see that responsibility in the center as a kind of intermediary notion can play a role for reasoning about functionality of trustworthy autonomous systems as it links backward and forward-looking responsibility, prospective and retrospective responsibility. But there are still open questions here. For instance, how to deal with epistemic actions. We have notions to think about, let's say, physical actions, or also known as brutal actions, but how this links to when we are talking about communicative actions or epistemic actions, institutional actions, how in such a mix we can model notion of accountability and then in turn help functionality of trustworthy autonomous systems. So I think here we just talk about two challenges. This is the second one, and also two challenges for retrospective. In the long paper, we have, I think, 6 or 7 different challenges. The second challenge here in prospective responsibility in tasks is about reliability and resilience. Here, we are talking about how we can use degrees of responsibility as a way to model and also measure resilience of a system. For instance, you can think about the contribution by Jonker and Halpern, I think it was 2004. They focus on this idea that when you allocate one task to 2 different agents, they each get like less than 1 degree of responsibility for delivering such a task. Let's say here we are looking at prospective responsibility. But then in case one fails, the other one can deliver the task. So here, degrees of responsibility can be a way to measure degree of resilience and fault tolerance of such a system. But so how we can link degrees of responsibility with resilience and make sure that task is reliable and resilient is still an open question, but we see ways forward, for instance, using this Jonker-Halpern notion of responsibility for modeling resilience in such systems. So let's move to retrospective responsibility. Basically, this is when we talk about responsibility, the first thing that comes in mind is actually who to blame, who is liable for, let's say, a crash. So this is the easiest one, so I had to put it in the second place. The first one is responsibility attribution. Here, one main challenge is what is known as responsibility voids, or the problem of many hands. It should be more familiar for the audience, the philosophical audience, let's say. So basically, when a situation takes place, it's, for instance, an undesirable crash, we know that a group of agents are accountable or responsible for such a situation. But who, to what extent, is responsible is an open question. And there are various ways, for instance. We saw this problem as a cost-sharing problem and used tools from microeconomics to look at the whole responsibility as a cost and how we can share this responsibility as a cost among agents with respect to their contribution to this event. But again, when we want to integrate epistemic actions, it would be not that easy to use cost sharing. So it's still an open question. And so the idea of using their contribution is still applicable, but how to integrate institutional and epistemic actions. The other open challenge here is liability ascription. So it relates to the idea that we had before, like the first challenge, responsibility attribution. But our main problem here is not just responsibility voids. The main question here is, when we are talking about autonomous vehicles, for instance, autonomous agents, they are not like tools or artifacts that receive direct instructions. So we cannot simply apply qui facet per allum, facet per se. So who acts through another does the act himself. Here, we cannot see the owner or the passenger or the developer. And as you see here, I'm just counting various agents that can be different. Basically, the owner, the passenger, developer, they can be different entities. So who is to what extent responsible? Who is to what extent liable if something bad happens? We cannot simply apply like physical regimentation, put a vehicle in prison. So these vehicles have a body, but it's meaningless to put them in prison. And retributive punishment is meaningless here. We cannot basically punish them for the sake of punishment. Here we are thinking about like a way forward could be looking at utilitarian punishment and Bentham's view. and applying some sanctions to enforce some set of desirable norms. And we have large body of work on normative multi-agent systems and how these kind of sanctioning mechanisms can ensure, or whether they can ensure, to what extent they can ensure the enforcement of rules and norms. So we have large body from Mehdi, Dastani, from Dignam, Munir Singh. They all focus on this idea of using sanctioning as a means to ensure norms in a society of agents. And it's also in line with a recent line on applying reinforcement learning techniques. So we saw 4 challenges. Here we have 3 lines of research as like way forward towards a research agenda. The first one is what we call meta-responsibility reasoning. The idea here is to develop responsibility-aware agents and multi-agent systems. So it's still an open discussion, what's an intelligent agent? But now we are thinking about responsibility reasoning as a kind of meta level capacity of such intelligent agents. The idea is to develop agents that are aware of and capable of reasoning about their own responsibilities in an environment and also responsibilities of others. Basically, if an intelligent agent is capable of perceiving the environment and acting towards its goals within that environment, then an intelligent and responsible one is also capable of reasoning its own responsibilities and responsibilities of others within that context. So not just maximizing its, let's say, to reach toward its goals, but also to be aware what kind of responsibilities it has. The second one is about norm balancing responsibility reasoning. In the literature that we have on responsibility reasoning, let's say computational methods for responsibility reasoning, mostly those papers are focused on single norm. So something is violated, some norm is violated, and how we can think about responsibilities for such violation. But there are cases in which complying with one norm leads to violation of another norm. So how we can reason about such situations and who is to what extent responsible for a set of norms instead of a single norm. And the body of work on common sense reasoning can help us here to come up with the most plausible norm and then reason about responsibilities for violating more than one norm. So this is like the second line of research that we are thinking about. And finally, hybrid responsibility learning and reasoning tools. Models that we have are mostly fully aware of different actions that agents have, potential situations that may take place. And basically we have a kind of perfect knowledge judge here. So the author of the paper or the judge in that scenario, they're fully aware of what agents are capable of. But in real life situations, we know that judges may not be able to reason with full knowledge. So how we can here employ different machine learning techniques or probabilistic reasoning, we can just integrate into model-based responsibility reasoning tools. So mixing these two and coming with some hybrid reasoning and learning responsibility tools. So these were 3 lines, and now you see here like literature review how responsibility reasoning links to various fields here, how it relates to moral responsibility and legality, how we can use different responsibility logics, like line of work by Natasha Lechina, Logan, and Joe Halpern, how these ideas can help us reason about responsibilities, how it links to applied responsibility reasoning, for instance, applications for business process management, the line of work by Matteo Baldoni and others. The other side is how it links to the idea of response using norm-aware systems, so normative reasoning and responsibility, as I said before, the line of work by Dignam, Dastani, Munir Singh, they are all focused on this idea of applying norms for governance of socio-technical systems, how this body of research can help us reasoning about responsibilities. And finally, I have some discussion points to discuss about. You saw different classes of challenges. So Are there also other general classes of responsibility-related challenges? On the other side, are there any more specific and practice-oriented applications? For instance, recently I started thinking about responsibilities in platoons. So it's more specific, it has more specific challenges. Then how to deal with the moral dimension of responsibility? Are AI artifacts moral agents? Can they take responsibility at all? And then the question, do we actually need full autonomy as a condition, or full agency or free will as a condition for responsibility? Or can we think about graded or partial notions of responsibility? Do they make sense at all? Finally, the other question is how to reason about responsibility under flexible autonomy, situations in which agents may have full autonomy in some parts of the scenario and then they're more under control. So it's kind of flexible autonomy. Some points in time, agents act autonomously, and some points they're under control. So thanks for your attention. Let's discuss.